In response to the Good Doctor. Written by Maladroid. My dear Dr. Lewis, I must admit I was rather disturbed by your account of the events that led your posting, if not, I admit, more than a little intrigued by the science you employed in the reparation of young Mr. Minkowski. I knew of a man, an alumnus of my alma mater, a university of some renown in Massachusetts, which you may or may not have heard of. He went by the name of West, and met a rather unfortunate end at the hand of some of his patients. One may say he was a kindred spirit, yes? I do hope, however, that you do not meet an end of the same variety. Which brings me to the reason for this letter. You might consider me a scientist myself, though your brand of wisdom may be quite different from mine. I have spent the last 18 or so hours in experimentation and study in an attempt to find a solution for your rather unorthodox problem. And I have found a most unorthodox solution. If you have the time, I'd like to take you through the events that led to what you may decide is no less than your salvation. I don't read as much as I used to. You see, I tend to employ an assistant who I ask to read to me. I find that it prevents other distractions as I go about my work, and as it happens, this medium through which you have reached out, and through which I now respond, is a particular favorite of hers. She read your letter aloud to me as I observed the effects of a previous experiment on a recently discovered subspecies of flesh-eating beetle, what you, my good doctor, would call a treatment group, and recording how appealing they seemed to find several different types of carrion following a procedure designed to augment their appetites. I have always found that dermestidae are quite useful for skeletonizing new specimens, although I have always been dissatisfied with the length of time they require in which to do so. Forgive the digression, I find myself doddering in old age. I decided after having heard the account to develop a means to transfigure the elder Minkowski and his wife into swine, and set about preparing to do so. I recalled a book I had read a few translated passages of at university, which at the time I did not find particularly interesting, but in hindsight seemed just the thing. It had been wordy, very prosy and esoteric, and it read much like a religious text. Through a friend of mine who was a philologist and linguist, I was able to obtain a copy of his translation within the space of an hour. I keep a private zoo of animals which I use for my research, and as it happens, this zoo contained a sow, healthy if a little on the elderly side. The book I acquired, as well as a few others in my private library, suggested I would need her, so I brought her in from the barn and locked her in a cage in my study as I read. At length, after picking through half a loaf of bread and a bowl of bisque, I had pieced together a rough but promising method through which, hopefully, I could perhaps proceed. Aristotle once said that there is no genius without a mixture of madness, and I always regarded that as true. Don't mistake me. I don't mean to infer that I myself am a genius, but that the procedure itself is quite mad. Mad even be the framework you use to judge me after I describe the technique itself. But if it works, I would argue that whether or not I am Bibbly is completely irrelevant. I have twice mentioned that my science may be strange to you, and this is because, not unlike medical science, my art requires a living component. In this case, I required one with sentience. I would require a pig, of course, but I would also require Long Pig. I would require a human participant. Apart from my live-in assistant, I spend most of my time alone, and while I used to have many means of procuring willing subjects for my experimentation, age has slowed me down and my reputation is not quite what it used to be. Thus, I came to the conclusion that I would drug my assistant at dinner and make use of her. Once the narcotic had incapacitated her, I moved her with some difficulty into the study, laid her on the slab, and bound her. I lit a fire in the hearth against the cold and went to work butchering the sow as my assistant slept on the table, never stirring at the pained cries of the poor beast. If nothing else, I thought to myself, chuckling, if the procedure failed, at least I would have plenty of meat for my supper. It wasn't until I had nearly finished with the animal that my assistant began to stir into consciousness and turn her heads at the sound of my exerted grunting and the tearing of the sow's flesh. I saw the look of confusion on her face give way to an expression of fear as she tested her bonds. She attempted to scream, but with a command I silenced her, and when I was confident that she would remain silent, I continued my work until at length I finished. I had filled a large stone basin with pig's blood and carried it to the end of the table on which the girl still laid, bound by the extremities. I opened the translation of the ancient book I acquired from the philologist and found the particular incantation. I began to chant as I went to work with the knife. I made a cut here, a gash there, all perfectly executed as required by the ritual. I painted runes and non-Euclidean shapes in pig's blood on and around her. My chanting of the incantation rose to crescendo, and I threw my arms into the air. I am embarrassed to be so cliché. Expecting everything and observing nothing. At least at first. My ears presently filled with droning, and I reeled at the sensation of unfathomable revulsion as something shifted imperceptibly in the nothing. For a split second, I saw something at the other end of the table and shifted my eyes to glance at it. If only for a second, and felt a shattering in my mind. I was thrown backwards with great force, and yet I did not move. I felt the oppressive weight of something ancient and terrible, which filled the room like choking gas. I heard the sickening sounds of tearing, creaking, and popping, and I looked down suddenly and fearfully. Right before my eyes, the form of the woman who had once been my assistant was now horribly misshapen, and was continuing to contort and change right before my very eyes. The skin was tearing and mending, the bones breaking and reforming, everything undergoing a manner of change too terrible to describe. A mass of flesh and bone, roiling and writhing, until at length it began to take a sort of shape. I was forced to look away from it all, until all sound stopped suddenly, and I was struck almost physically by the lack of it, save for the gentle crackling of the fire. Slowly, Tentatively, I turned my head, and what I saw caused me to gasp audibly. I saw a large sow, horribly malformed be it, and barely alive. As I looked at it, it twitched and rolled slightly, which only emphasized the horrible deformities which strongly resembled human musculature, twisted and broken in order to take the shape of a pig. The thing turned its head in a slow, pained movement to look at me, and I saw in its eyes only agony and despair. It opened its mouth and cried wordlessly, its anguish in a woman's voice, before falling silent and still, overcome by powerful melancholy, which was almost palpable. No matter, I said to myself, I had done it. So you see, Dr. Lewis, I have a solution for you. There will be a cost, however, one which my masters demand, not I. If you are ready to accept that cost, then I am ready to implement my solution. So it seems you have a choice to make. I'm sure I needn't remind you that the lives of your family are at stake. I don't envy you your position, of course, out of the frying pan and into the fire, so to speak. But we must all make sacrifices for the ones we love, I suppose. Eternally yours, Elias Khan.